Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Simpson, and I'm a member of the IMechE Management Group Board and a previous chairman. I'd like to start by introducing my two colleagues, who are also members of the Management Group Board. Tim Podesta, who will be making the presentation, and Paul Ballington, who will be joining us at the discussion stage of the webinar. Perhaps just a few background points regarding your speakers. Tim Podesta has completed some 35 years with BP and has held senior positions in the technical, commercial, and leadership areas, and has specific expertise in investment analysis and benchmarking. He is very experienced as a presenter in these topics. Paul Barrington has over 30 years of experience in steel, power, energy, and aerospace. He is Senior Finance Manager and responsible for business evaluation at Rolls-Royce plc. He's been engaged in A&M work, product and technology development, corporate recovery, and business development throughout this time. He was originally qualified as a metallurgist and then transferred into mechanical engineering. He holds an MBA at Manchester and is on the board, a member of the University of Lancaster School of Engineering Advisory Board. I am responsible for running a firm of consulting engineers. Much of our business is overseas in Germany and the USA. I previously was responsible for manufacturing companies in the UK, the USA, Germany, and the Netherlands. I also have an MBA, and I'm a Sloan Fellow at the London Business School. So that is a very brief introduction to the three speakers. Just a few words now regarding the management group. The management group at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers aims to support the development of all engineers to maximize their potential and recognize leaders of the future. We aim to increase the managerial skills of engineers with a particular focus on younger engineers making a critical transition from a mainly technical role into management positions. We want to promote and distribute best practice in engineering management to our members both in the UK and overseas. We see it as a very important responsibility to support the Essential Management Skills Conference, which takes place each year, and I would encourage all of our listeners to consider attending this. It provides very valuable information concisely and very effectively. We want to provide general encouragement and support to the UK engineering sector, which is so vital in terms of generating exports and hence supporting the overall economy. And also, finally, we wish to increase the number of engineers occupying senior leadership roles both in the private and public sectors and in academia. So that's just a very brief summary of our aims and objectives, and I'd like at this stage to hand over to my colleague Paul Ballington.
Thank you, Christopher. Previously, in the first webinar in this series, we had 750 engineers connected with our webinar that aimed to give an overview of the interaction of finance with engineering. We had fantastic participation in the question and answer session, and we ran out of time, even though we'd run over time, with over 100 questions still to be answered. A strong theme in these questions was how businesses should decide which projects to choose. In our answers, we strove to encourage engineers to use other techniques than payback analysis and to think about the time value of money and cash flow. Today, I'd like to introduce Tim Podesta, who's going to talk to you about his experience of this field and introduce these concepts to you. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Christopher and Paul, for your kind introductions and for setting the context for my talk today. I'll refer to some of the points made by Christopher and Paul in their introductions as I go through. So to start, imagine you are in a leadership role on a project and your instinct tells you there is a flaw in the business case. Is there something missing in the investment analysis? What do you do? So good morning and good afternoon. My name is Tim Podesta, and a couple of years ago I celebrated 35 years with BP and completed my time with them. I'm currently an independent consultant, and my latest assignment was as a program director working on an EU exit project for program departments, setting up plans and a PMO for all possible scenarios. I'm currently working on a portfolio of assignments related to my areas of subject matter expertise in investment analysis, front-end planning and benchmarking. And I have a passion for professional development of myself and others. Now, to the subject of this webinar, I've discussed investment analysis with many project managers and engineers, and there's a view that the project economics are not normally the responsibility of the project manager or engineering manager. But I would argue that it would be helpful, in fact very helpful, for PMs and EMs to understand the drivers of value that underpin a project. So the objective of this webinar is to give you a greater awareness of the key factors affecting the business case and give you greater confidence in questioning and challenging decisions that have the biggest impact on business case, both before the project is sanctioned and when the project is in flight. I'm also passionate about projects, in particular making sure we're choosing the right project and then making sure we do the chosen project right. We have about 45 minutes or so today, and I plan to share a series of personal stories and give you some tips from my experience, leaving some time for Q&A. So my first story is about a Petrochemicals joint venture project in the Middle East. Now, I was part of the project negotiating team looking to do a deal between my company and the National Oil Company. Involved representatives of the National Oil Company, local businessmen, sheiks, their advisors, and from my company, senior business and project executives. We were in a grand house in London. This was the house that senior executives would use for big meetings. They even had a butler there and a chef in the kitchen. Now, I was relatively inexperienced at the time and responsible for the project analysis and business case. So one of the first things I learned about investment analysis, which is fundamental, is the importance of the assumptions that are being made. My analysis for this particular project included data and assumptions on all the key variables and showed that one of the biggest uncertainties was the logistic cost of moving the finished product. Would there be a fixed tariff, dollars per ton, or would there further investment required, millions of dollars, in port facilities to export the product? I could see that the high freight cost or significant additional capital cost would make the project much less economic. I pointed this out to my senior company executive, and he asked me to present the economic case and draw attention to the key assumptions, including the logistics uncertainties. Now, I remember being in an oak-paneled boardroom, sitting at a large oval table with the smell of fine wood paneling. Around the table, there were the sheikhs, their expert advisors, and the BP executives. Discussions were intense, and it came to the shared economic model that I had prepared. I felt nervous because I had big news to present, and maybe a deal breaker. Our business executive, a gnarly, grisly sort of character, turned to me and said, "Tim, please present the project economics." Everyone went quiet. I outlined the economics. Then I highlighted the impact of the uncertainty of logistics assumptions, the consequence on the project value of a significant dollar per ton charge, or a multi-million-dollar investment for jetties and loading facilities. I sensed the interest and the tension in the room. I paused and looked at my boss, and he said very firmly, carry on, Tim. The stage was truly mine and was away, the adrenaline flowing. I was then chairing a discussion of the project value and key drivers, and there were lots of heated debate about the facts, and the logistic costs were accepted as a key variable. To manage the uncertainty, there was an undertaking from the national oil company that these costs would not impact the project economics. They would cover these arrangements, and later that day, the deal was done. The learning for me that having a shared understanding and clarity on the project assumptions, the facts, help drive a good deal. For me, all projects need that clarity up front, and the project manager or engineering manager would do well to have that understanding as well. So having been given the stage by a senior executive, my career never looked back. There was the opportunity to lead that I grasped and became a company subject matter expert in the matter of investment analysis. And here I am today to share that expertise with you. So, my tips for understanding investment analysis. What I like to do is refer to something I call the J-curve, cash flow. The J-curve shows cash flow and is the basis of economic evaluation. There are two parts, basically, the outflow investment, the expense, and the inflow of revenue, the return. All economic analysis is based on the cash flow. And where I work, we use two main economic indicators that were calculated for each project and used as part of the business case. The net present value and the internal rate of return. I'll describe these more later. So, to bring this more to life, let's take a look at the assumptions behind the value calculation. And these are key to understanding the business case. A business case is only as good as the assumptions that underlie it. Now, stepping back a bit, what is your favorite sport or TV competition show? Is it football, cricket, rugby, or even Strictly Come Dancing? So what do you look for? You look for the score. Remember that point as I explained investment analysis for you, with the important thing being the score. On the next slide, you'll see that I've used an acronym SCORE to describe the assumptions in particular categories. S is for the sanction of the project, C, the capital cost, O, the operating startup, R, the revenue stream, and E, the endurance of the asset. I think it's a nice acronym because it implies a reference point, a benchmark for the key assumptions that need to be delivered by a project plan. So to help with my explanation, on this slide, I've made some assumptions to give a picture of what a project might look like. Now, first of all, for sanction, we have a cost of capital. Now, I've used a figure of 10% here. As mentioned in the introduction, cost of capital is a critical piece of data. It depends very much on the organization you're in and the context for the project, and it actually merits a presentation on its own right, maybe for a later date. Today, I've chosen a conservative one of 10%, but I've seen other numbers in the range of 5 to 7% used as well. Capital cost, I've taken a value of £100, it could be millions or thousands. Over 2 years, that's 50 per year. Operating startup, I've taken 2 years from sanction of the project to startup. Revenue, I've looked at a 10-year life of the project at 10 per year, so that's 200. At 20 per year, 200. And endurance of 10 years. NPV, net present value, is one of the two economic indicators. It's in effect the sum of the discounted cash flow. The internal rate of return, the IRR, is the interest rate from the net cash flow. What I'm going to do is explain that to you in a bit more detail so that you understand how these assumptions affect those values. So moving on from a chart to a spreadsheet. And in this spreadsheet, effectively a table format, I have recreated those assumptions to try and show you as clear as possible how you would calculate the NPV and IRR. First of all, you can see the assumptions listed there, the sanction, the capex operating, the revenue over time, and the discount rate. First thing to do is to add two lines in red, which are in effect are the net cash flow. and using this curve, the cumulative, as you can see in the line towards the middle of the table, cumulative cash flow, you can see that cumulatively you come to a point where you get to a payback point. The thing about payback, it is another indicator on projects, but beware. As you can see, once you get to a point of zero, if you just take an indicator which is based on that length of time, you are ignoring the impact of the benefits, the cash flow and value beyond that. So it can be a false indicator of long-term value. So a word of warning there. Next thing to add is the discount rate, which you'll see in red at the bottom of this table, based on which is 10%, a discount factor, which is in effect a reducing number which reduces by 10% per year. And then using that with the net cash flow, you get a discounted cash flow. This is a very important line. Now, using that discounted cash flow, we can get the overall NPV, which you can see here is showing as 15. And the IRR is calculated as the effective interest rate of the net cash flow. Or alternatively, it could be described as the discount rate to give you a zero NPV. So that's a quick calculation of NPV and IRR. So what do you think of those figures? This would, in my mind, be a reasonable investment as long as we are confident in the assumptions. So with that behind us, let's look at the impact of some of those assumptions, and I can share some stories which show the importance in real life situations. Going back to the J curve again, the assumptions and the NPV and IRR, which I'll refer back to as we go through each of the elements of the score assumptions. So let's start with the sanction of the project, which is arguably the most important point. And this is where there is a go, no-go point and where choices are made between investment options. So from my experience, the decision at this point is basically on the investment analysis and also judgment by executives. And this judgment is linked to choices that are available across the portfolio and also with alignment to company strategy. The value impact of a go, no-go decision here is clear. No investment means no value, but also no value at risk. Also, the investment funds can be used for another project, and then there's the value which another project can bring. Then the other outcome at this point can be a recycling of the project, which can both protect and add value if there are concerns or if there's a better way. So to illustrate the importance of sanction as a point of a project, what I want to do is to share my second story, which is around some work I did working on refining and chemical synergy in France. I was leading a synergy project at a refinery near Marseille. The goal was to identify projects that would deliver value from synergy between a refinery and a chemical plant. I was leading a team of local experts working in French, which was something I really enjoyed doing. And from a long list of ideas, we developed a sense of a series of project options: a joint power plant investment, a refinery propylene feedstock extract for making polypropylene, and an integrated feedstock planning process. Now, this portfolio of investment decisions had a governance board comprising executives from the headquarters in London, from refining, the head was American, the head of Petrochemicals was a Brit. In Paris, we had the marketing office head, was a French Parisian, and two other site operations directors, one who was a German and one other a French from Marseille. So a real diversity of cultures that we had done a lot of work with to lobby in preparation for reviewing our cases. Now, I remember the key moment at one of the governance meetings in the boardroom in London. I presented the options and the economics. There were $20 million of value on the table, based on a J-curve similar to the one I've shown you. And I was asked directly, how confident are you? I was being asked about the assumptions in the business case, something that one of my old mentors called a red face test. So to respond to the critical question, I said, I'm very confident. I was standing on the quality of the technical and commercial work done by my team and the preparatory work we had done working with the decision makers and the investment analysis we had underpinning it. Thankfully, the response was a definitive yes. All the projects were successfully implemented and integration of refinery and chemicals significantly enhanced, so much so that the site was sold some years later as an integrated unit. So that's Sanction, the first part of the set of assumptions. What I want to take you to now is capital costs. These are the main investment spend, and one area where the project or engineering manager has most control and responsibility. There's a strong correlation to good front-end planning, and benchmarking has proven that incomplete scope development can lead to significant cost and schedule overruns. Now, I personally have extensive experience of using a front-end planning tool called the Project Definition Rating Index, PDRI, which I'll mention later. Now, going back to our assumptions, if there was an overspend against those initial assumptions of 100, if we went over by 17%, we would wipe out the value of our project, making the NPV 0 and the IRR 10%. That's a test which is quite often made on value of projects, the 0 NPV test, and it's a good test on the impact of it changing assumptions. So 17% overspend on the assumptions we made earlier would wipe out the value of this project. Operating startup is the second area that the project manager and engineering manager have most influence over. And in effect, it's meeting the scheduled startup date, the date when production operation commences, and it's a key planning date. Meeting this date is very important as the delay to revenues can be a big hit on value, particularly for a high margin product. And an early start can make the advantageous as well. There are also assumptions that will be made around the time taken to reach full production and the reliability of the early phases, which can impact early revenue and value. So the value of overrun is worth noting here. A 50% overrun would wipe out the value of our project and make the NPV 0. So overrun is an important assumption to make. My particular example of cost and schedule comes from working with oil and gas pipeline projects, and it relates to the importance of good front-end planning to avoid overspend and overruns. And this is where we use the tool I mentioned, the Project Definition Rating Index, which is created by the North American Construction Industry Institute, the CII. Now, I have much more detail on the value from front-end planning, which would make a subject for another talk. But what research has shown is that using PDRI to help with good front-end planning can lead to cost savings of up to 25% and schedule reduction of up to 17%, which can significantly enhance value. So my story here was my involvement in using the PDRI tool for several major oil and gas pipeline projects for oil and gas fields of Azerbaijan, with exports going through Georgia to Turkey. So I facilitated a series of PDRI workshops in the contractors' offices in London, next to Paddington. And as it moved up through the planning stage to final investment decision point, we held a number of workshops, and one in particular I remember. For these, it's important to have all the key disciplines represented, including project manager, project services manager, lead engineers, representatives of the environmental team and operations team. So as a facilitator for this workshop, my role was to listen and to lead, listening for the quietest voice. We ran through the key front-end planning elements, the plans, cost estimates, engineering definitions. Then there was a question around the EIA, the Environmental Impact Assessment, and the environment and permitting requirements. Now, a quiet voice piped up. yes, we've done these, but we need to go for stakeholder review. Project manager said, good, that's done. I interjected, tell me more. The quiet voice of the environmental specialist piped up, we need partner and government approval. Tell me more. And that was the moment when there was clearly a gap between the apparent status and actions that were needed to make sure that these approvals would be in place and therefore the project would not be delayed. So having had these workshops, we were able to reinforce the value of good front-end planning, give the assurance to capital costs and particularly operating startup, and therefore enhance the quality of the plan towards success. Now I'm pleased to say that the pipeline projects have been successfully completed and the volumes of oil and gas have increased from Azerbaijan to Europe. That's capital and operating. So revenue, this is the income. This is the revenue net of costs, sometimes called the margin, where costs may be logistics and operating expenses. So income is arguably one of the most significant value drivers, particularly if it's a function of the price and the volume. And volume can be dependent on the design production rate at a given availability as well, so other key assumptions that need to be delivered. Now, the value of overestimating revenue is pretty significant. So if we underperformed in terms of 15% under our assumptions in terms of the revenue, that would wipe out the value of our project and make the NPV zero. So my particular story about revenue relates to a project I was involved with working with the legal function, and the revenue related to the benefits which were assumed for the delivering of an IT strategy for the lawyers. So it was basically an IT project, and the benefits were based on improving the efficiency of the legal team. There were over 250 in-house lawyers around the world, and the benefit was assessed as the time saved through the use of technology, allowing lawyers to do other work, and the avoided cost of reduced spend of external counsels providing support. The Deputy Legal Counsel, who was our sponsor and wanted to embrace the opportunity, included the benefit of giving his legal team new technology, including Blackberries. Now, I remember him stressing at a project sponsor meeting, I'm convinced we should give all our lawyers these new Gooseberry devices. Now, despite his mistake with the name, he was a very supportive, engaged as a sponsor, which is important for projects. Now, having derived the business case and the assumptions, these were translated into time saved and external counsel hours to give a cash flow benefit and an equivalent NPV. And I remember presenting to the global leadership team in Los Angeles, where there was a major legal team. I had a room full of lawyers, and as I presented, their eyes were open, their jaws were dropping as I showed them the cash flow curve. The chief counsel said, this is the first time an NPV has been presented to us. And when I'd finished, he grinned, and I thought, oh dear, what's the joke here? Thankfully, he strongly endorsed the strategy and associated projects. And the new technology, matter management workflow has been introduced, and the legal team have fully embraced the new technologies and realized the benefits. So as far as revenue is concerned, that can include not only product benefits, but also benefits in terms of working practices as well. And finally, last but not least, the endurance. This is another big driver for project value, and normally is strongly associated with meeting the strategic intent of the organization, which may be normally is long term. It's less important for rate of return and indeed payback, which we talked about earlier, but certainly for value, it is hugely important. And my experience is that companies will not normally look at value beyond 10 years unless there's a very secure business or significant strategic intent being delivered by the investment. Now, my example relates to long-term gas projects. Now, these can look at investment periods of up to 15 or even 20 years. And when we go back to our initial assumptions and model, we had an endurance of 10 years. If we add an extra 3 years to make the duration 13 years, that actually doubles the value of the project. On the flip side, if we take the 10 years down to 8 years, that would make the NPV 0. So endurance is a key variable in looking at value. I mean, the context for my story is actually climate change and the general concern with the issue of global warming. Now, according to BP's review of world energy and forecast to 2040, there's a double-edged approach that is required. Obviously, it's a big issue for the world. The world needs more energy, as many countries strive to develop, but to meet the need for energy, there's a need for there to be a much lower carbon usage. To deliver this, an approach is to strive for more gas in the portfolio and alternative energy to support a sustainable lower carbon future. Now, BP was the first oil company to embrace the need to change and to be green. And in his speech made at Stanford in 1997, Lord Browne emphasized that point. And the solution at that time was the shift to developing more gas, which is much more efficient fuel than oil and coal, and also the shift into alternative energy as part of the portfolio. Now, this at the time led to a major strategy for gas, and part of that was sourcing gas for Europe. And my final story related to my experience of investment analysis was when I was part of the European gas strategy development, part of the green agenda. My role as part of that was to provide the business case with investment analysis. The strategy was to develop a diverse supply of Europe's from the north, south and east. There was a large portfolio of projects requiring major investments in production facilities and export via long pipelines. My particular project was the development of gas in Algeria from the Sahara and exporting north via Italy and Spain into Europe. This business development required long-term contracts, 50 to 20 years, with European buyers covering volume and price. And the decision to proceed was based on a mixture of firm contracts and judgment on the market demand for full production volumes and price based on analysis of market characteristics. Once again, I remember the red face test, and in a meeting in Stockley Park, Oxbridge, near Heathrow, I was in the gas business chief exec's office, a very hard-nosed businessman, very sharp. He was a highly successful retail businessman as well. And he asked me with steely eyes about the market assumptions on volume and price and their basis. I explained the premise based on a portfolio of long-term contracts and the growing market for gas and the value of that gas against competing fuels, coal and oil. It was clearly a red face test, and I showed my confidence in the assumptions and their basis. I passed, and the chief executive gave his full support to the huge investments required. And rolling the clock forward, the strategy has been hugely successful. Gas is a major part of the company's portfolio, and the Algerian asset has produced successfully over 20 years now, and reinvestment has continued. Now, a recent example of the gas strategy are the major gas projects in Asia, and my earlier example described one of those. So I hope those stories have been helpful alongside my model of the J-curve and the score assumptions. So to conclude my part, I would say that an understanding of value is important and helpful to the project manager and engineering manager. And knowing the score can be an important tool. And at the end of the day, the value proposition is fundamental to doing the right project and doing the project right. So that concludes my contribution. I'm delighted to take questions and hand back to Paul, who will share those. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. We'd now like to open up the meeting to questions from those listening in. And while we're receiving those questions, Chris and I can talk you through the actual calculation of MPV and IRR, if that's useful. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Tim, for a very interesting talk. As I said, Chris Simpson and myself be happy to talk a little bit more through the calculation of MPV with a couple of cautionary warnings. Basically, the MPV is calculated in almost a reciprocal way of interest. So if you're paying simple interest on £100 over a year, you pay 110, and it's 10%, you pay £110. So if you're looking at how would I see the value of £100 if I get it in a year's time versus getting it today, you could actually say, well, if my interest rate is 10%, I will have the reciprocal of that. So you would work out the present value of the £100 in a year's time by adding your interest rate of 10% to 1. So you've got 1.1 again, so just as you would previously. But then you divide your £100 by the 1.1, and you'll end up with a number just over £90. And so similarly, when you look at a series of cash flows, or as Tim said, a series of margins, then you can look at whether those margins are positive or negative over the years of, say, a 20 or 25-year project. And if you work out the present value of each year's margin, you can then work out the net present value by adding all those together. And that tells you that in today's money, as of today, what is the value of doing this piece of business? And to do that, you literally just have to have in mind that the year you start out from is year 0, and then you go out to year 19 or out to year 20. And so you then work out, then your formula would become that you'd have your cash flow or your margin would be divided by 1 plus the interest rate, which in this case we would call the discount rate, 10%, so you get 1.1, and you raise that to the power of the number of years, so if it's 19 or 20 years. So there you can see that £100 in 20 years' time would only be worth about 15% in today's money, as against having £100 right now. I'd like to invite Chris to comment a little bit on the importance, and I can't emphasize this enough, of picking the right discount rate to use, because these methods are so powerful that they really can mislead. But on the other hand, they are the most powerful, informative way of doing this. What would you like to say, Chris, on that thing?
Yes, I'd be very pleased to come in at that stage. Could I just suggest that if any of the listeners would like to have some copies of the calculations for net present value or the alternative for internal rate of return, we're very happy to make those available to you. Now, picking up on the very important point that Paul has referred to, how do you calculate the discount rate? The straightforward answer is that most companies use their own cost of capital, or it's sometimes called weighted average cost of capital, this being the preferred discount rate. Now, in its very simplest terms, that rate can be the interest rate that a company pays on its borrowings, or if it's a public company with shareholders, it would be the rate of return that the shareholders expect on their investment. Now, that is the basic concept behind it. But it's perhaps just worthwhile summarizing why the value of money related to time diminishes. Intuitively, and I'm sure you would all understand that, but there are three factors involved in this. The first is that funds that are available now can be invested and produce a return or generate interest, whereas funds that are available at some time in the future cannot, at least directly, be used at the present time. So that's the first factor. The second factor is that if you have funds available now, they are secure. Any funds predicted to be available in the future are less certain. So that's the second factor. And the third one, which in an era of relatively low interest rates and low inflation is not so significant, but obviously a sum of money available today will very likely buy more than an equal sum that's available at some time in the future. So those are the three fundamentals as to why we discount the cash flow. Now, as I said, in its simplest terms, the discount rate refers to either the interest rate that the company is paying or the expected rate of return of the shareholders. But it's common to add on an after-tax premium to the basic rate. In other words, to use a higher discount rate for higher risk investments and a lower discount rate when expected returns from a proposed investment, shall we say, is seen as exhibiting a lower risk. So the higher rate is viewed as a hedge against risk, because it attaches relatively more emphasis or weight on the returns on the investment achieved in the earlier periods compared to returns in the future. I hope that is of some assistance. Paul, would you wish me to expand further on that, or should we move on to another topic at this stage?
Well, I was just looking at the questions that have come in, and everybody who's sent in questions so far, I am going down through them and picking out ones that represent a common theme or cover more than one question. If you don't get your question answered, then do feel free to reach out after the webinar. I think there is a very, very interesting question from Ian Godfrey. And what Ian is asking is, he's saying he's responsible for an R&D department in the company. They use discounted cash flow models to make cases for the adoption of new technology. However, as most of their customers are outside Europe, or outside of Europe and in North America, I assume he means outside the UK and in Europe and North America, how do you choose the right discount rate in that context? And this is bringing in an important feature of this, is that you have to apply the right assumptions about how the values of currencies are going to change. So you have to actually, when you're working out what your margin is going to be, you'll be applying the right conversion factor to those currencies. And also you'd be looking at the right, if you're pricing in those currencies, you've got to get the right inflation in there. And this is a critical thing of doing this analysis, is that you need to make sure that you're applying the appropriate escalations and discounts to the elements that build up your business case. And so in that case, you've got all those issues of exchange rates, different inflations between the country you're making the product in and the country you're selling it in. And then you get into how do we manage that, which is a whole different area to discuss. What would you like to add to that, Chris, to Ian's question?
Yes, I think we may have perhaps given the impression that this is a one-off calculation. In practice, what one will do is make a whole series of assumptions, varying discount rates, different assumptions on expected inflation, movement on exchange rates, etc., in order to determine the sensitivity of any change. And I recollect that Tim Podesta touched on this subject during his presentation. But it is very important to do that initial calculation and then look at the sensitivity of making changes to some of the basic assumptions. Mm-hmm. You then start to build up a picture of where the risks lie and where the exposures are, and then consider what action possibly can be taken to mitigate those risks.
Yes, that's super. Thank you for that, Chris. We've got a couple of questions here which are really pertinent to asking for more detail about what Tim was discussing. So I think we will have rested Tim for a moment or two, and he could come back to us on these. I think the first one is, could Tim just go back over the meaning of NPV and IRR? And then we'll lead in back into some of the other questions from there. Could you take that on, Tim?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Paul. So going back to slide 8, I know we can't do that, but on that I described the NPV, the net present value, as the sum of the discounted cash flow. And that, for the work example I did, came to the answer of 15. So when I showed the additional red line of discounted cash flow, the cumulative of that, the sum of that, I'll repeat, the sum of the discounted cash flows over the period of the project came to the value of 15. So the NPV is the sum of the discounted cash flow, and the IRR, the internal rate of return, is the if you look at the net cash flow, which is undiscounted before discounting, it's the effective interest rate that derives from that net cash flow. That's the IRR. Those are two questions I think have come in from Sophia and Jack, so I hope that's helpful. And I think the third question I can address, looking at the priority list, is looking at I made a comment about the use of the PDRI tool, the Project Definition Rating Index tool, in relation to schedule impact. And I'll repeat that the percentage impact of doing good front-end planning is 17%, 17%, so you can have that increased confidence in the schedule outcome from using good front-end planning. I'll hand back to Paul for more questions.
Yeah, I think there is a very interesting question from Innocent come in, and the question there is, understanding how important it is to get the analysis factor stroke input as accurate as possible, how would you put together the market assumptions, especially where the market trend is not very clear and very volatile? So I think Tim's talked quite a lot about this thing of testing the assumptions and testing how much headroom you've got in those assumptions before the project loses its value. If Tim would like to talk a bit more about that, and then I'll probably talk about, and Chris as well, about what's the limitation of this technique when you're into an uncertain product area or you're into very uncertain conditions. So over to Tim first, and then back to myself and Chris.
Yes, that's a great question, and I think it's two parts to this answer. One is getting the best sort of reference that's possible. In my example, here would be oil price, and there are many views on oil price out there, and invariably it would be a corporate assumption as to what price to be assuming for a particular analysis, and you get a range to consider, particularly on the downside. you would be prudent to look at what the market might do if oil price was to be lower. And then the other thing about assumptions is understanding what your competitors are able to do. And there's a technique which, if you actually look at the opportunity your competitors have to invest in a similar market, you need to be confident that whatever price the market will bear will not be undercut by your competitors. So that's another test you can look at. But clearly, the assumptions you make on the market can be the most uncertain, and you have to. This is where I think that the judgment comes in the risk the company's making. About yourself, Paul?
Yeah. So one of the things is yes, these techniques are very good where you're involved in a technology that already exists and there's a reasonable amount of stability. It doesn't have to be totally stable. But I was glad that Tim introduced the factor of thinking what your competitors can do. And so there's a whole separate area of investment analysis that gets a lot more complicated than this that you do use in those situations, where you use techniques such as real options, where you actually look at it from the, if you like, the customer's perspective of what choices they can make. And similarly, if you're looking about competing technologies, you can start asking what-if questions, if you like, on a binomial tree of, well, my MPV is going to be X million if this decision is taken. But on the other hand, if another decision is taken, it may be a lot lower. Is that still acceptable? So you start looking at those, what if my technology is not one that everybody adopts and my market size is only 20% what I thought it was going to be? Is that a risk we can manage? Is there something we can do about that? And this is where you start getting into, as Chris was saying previously, you start doing lots of scenario analysis on this, and then you can build it up and sort of look at it as almost a story of, if these events happen, it comes out this way, and if it comes in, and if these decisions are taken, it will come out at a different value. And that is very powerful because it will help you understand how you might want to influence those decisions about technology. Anything you'd like to add to that, Chris?
No, I think that summarizes it very effectively. My anticipation is that as far as our audience is concerned, many of you will be involved in long-term major projects, investment projects such as oil and gas. But others perhaps are considering an investment in a new machine tool. And the methodology that we have described so far, appropriate to a gas or an oil project, is equally appropriate to determining the value of an investment in a new technology or in a new machine tool. And in those circumstances, first of all, your time horizons are likely to be much shorter. I mean, for machine tools, for instance, you would probably not wish to go out beyond 7 years from the initial investment. So clearly, the shorter the time scale, the greater confidence you have in the cash stream that you're forecasting. The other factor is just going back to, if I could slightly sidetrack, I think it's Joanne Hutchison asked us to remind her what IRR stands for, and that is internal rate of return. Now, essentially, what that is doing is looking at the cash flow stream that Tim has so well defined, and then discounting that plus the initial investment at a rate that comes to a sum of zero. So whereas the net present value determines the profitability of a project in terms of, what should I say, the incremental change in the value of the business, the internal rate of return reflects the timing of the cash flows, but does not use market discount rates. I hope that is a little helpful.
Okay, that's very useful. We've got two interesting questions about the discount rate. One is Tim probably will choose to defer on, but asking about whether 10% discount rate is real for BP and what does BP use. The second question, which I think we can probably go into a bit more detail, is Moses is asking, how does the rate of inflation influence the discount rate? And I did threaten Chris that I'd ask him to explain the difference between real and nominal.
Well, I'm going to slightly duck that question, otherwise we're going to be here for a long time. But usually the way of handling the inflation is to build that inflation into your initial undiscounted cash flow, and then use what you determine to be the most appropriate discount rate. And again, as you've heard a number of times already, you probably won't do one calculation, but you'll look at various scenarios and various assumptions on the inflation rate and its effect on the undiscounted cash stream for that particular project.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you, Chris. And Moses, we will probably do another seminar at some point in the future where it feels like it's either that or something in the Management Essentials course where we'll dig into this in quite some detail about how to do this. We've got a few questions where people are asking to get copies of the formulas and the calculations. That's something we'll probably take back to the Institute and say, should we produce a pamphlet? Would be my feeling, but we'll have to ask the Institute about that.
And Paul, maybe we can share the slides. That might be helpful.
Yeah. Well, the slides should be available in the future to review from the Institute website as well.
Yes.
Paul, it may well be possible to add one or two additional slides setting out the formula that we've been discussing.
Yes,
I anticipate that we're talking to a largely very numerate audience who are going to be perfectly comfortable seeing a set of mathematical formula in front of them.
Yes.
Yes, I suggest we add that as an appendix to send the slides out. I do want to make one point, having looked at the questions before we close. A number of them have been about the duration of the project, and actually one very, very good question about residual value or life cycle of projects. That's something that I didn't fully cover in the J cover. It is possible for a project with we need to decommission at the end. There will be a consideration of cost at that point as well, whether it's 10, 15, 20 years down the line. That's the final point I'd like to add. Thank you, Paul.
Okay.
Yes. Could I perhaps just, as Christopher, just come in there? I referred a few minutes ago to the appropriateness of this methodology for analyzing investment in things like machine tools. Well, and I'd suggested probably a period of 7 years is appropriate. It's also influenced, obviously, by the tax conditions that prevail and the amount of depreciation that you're allowed by the tax authorities to apply. But one of the great values of using discounted cash flow is that at the end of that 7-year period, it's quite probable that that investment will still have a value. If it's a piece of plant or equipment, it could be sold on second hand. And it's very usual to actually put a residual value in at the end of your forecast cash flow, and then you discount that residual value back in order to determine the net present value of the project.
Mm-hmm. That's useful. I just think there's a useful summing up question from Andre at Cummins. And this might be a good question to end on, because it does let us give some people cautionary tales about methods. And what Andre is asking is, with the current speed of technological advancements in a number of competing technologies, has the risk of accurately planning, and how can we ensure our endurance is accurate? That to me is where you get into Tim was calling it the red face test, but it's all the area of, as Chris has said, the maths is not difficult. The danger is in the power of the method. And so you need to think very, very carefully about the assumptions being taken, and whether there is bias in that, and also the behaviours of the people involved. Is somebody desperately wanting to sell a scheme, in which case they'll skew the assumptions? Chris, is there any way we can really remove that risk? And is planning getting more difficult? It feels like it is.
Yes, is the straight answer to that. But my response always is, well, you may have a methodology that is in itself not perfect, but any rigorous analysis is going to be much better than no analysis at all. And if I might be slightly provocative, one of the problems we have in the UK is a very large amount of what I dare call financial illiteracy when it comes to assessing the potential for a particular investment project. There are so many projects, I fear, that never see the light of day just simply because senior management or outside investors insist on such a high hurdle rate, in other words, such a high discount rate, that these potentially very valuable investment projects never see the light of day. So as engineers, it is very important to stand your ground and not allow accountants and other financial people to impose discounted rates or hurdle rates that make projects unviable or make them appear to be unviable.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good point. And also there's a balancing danger from hurdle rates becoming used as a normal discount rate. It can drive some interesting behaviours as well, and decisions in a project if they're unrealistically high.
We haven't, I think, made any real reference to what sadly is the prevalent method of analysing investment in terms of payback. Tim, I know in his presentation, referred to the fact that any positive cash flow streams after the end of the payback period are ignored, which is one of the fundamental problems and reasons why just using payback should be avoided, in my judgment, at all cost. It is not an appropriate way of assessing the value or otherwise of a potential investment.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we're about coming to the end of our allotted time. There are some questions. I think we've got the major gists or themes of the questions out there. Just going around, Tim and Chris, have I missed a question you'd like to answer? Or are we getting to a point where we can...
I think I've been scanning through. I think we've given... There's quite a lot of reference to life cycle.
Yes.
And then there's a question these days of political risk. That's, to say the least, a challenging question of carbon net zero. Certainly we live in very uncertain times, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to fall back on what has already been suggested, look at a whole raft of different scenarios and then progressively come to a conclusion as to that you believe best fits the circumstances you find yourself in.
Yes, and of course around risk, if you do a classical and rigorous risk management process and you give probabilities and valuations to those risks, you can of course put those risks into your MPV calculation and to see if you can afford them.
Yes, absolutely.
Certainly, yes. And I think sometimes people don't do that. They don't become quantitative enough about risk.
Paul,
So,
we're, I think, coming close to conclusion now. I would like to make one request of our listeners. We're intending to continue with a series of further webinars. The ones that we have run so far have been extraordinarily successful, and the feedback we've had is very encouraging. But we would very much welcome you making suggestions as to what further areas in the financial field you feel we should cover and which may be helpful to you. So any feedback would be very welcome.
Yes, and following that theme, a couple of people have asked questions and I've responded back to them and said contact me via my office and given a contact number. I'd be happy to receive follow-up emails or follow-up questions or what have you. If you contact the Institute, I'm sure there's a way that they can be fed through to me.
Yes, and it's Tim here. Likewise, maybe even by some mechanism like LinkedIn, lots of really, really good questions and ones which will require a bit more time to answer properly. Happy to take those offline.
Okay. In which case, then, I think it's time for the panel to thank Tim Podesta for his presentation. And then, even more importantly than that, if I'm allowed to say that, is I'd like to thank everybody who's attended today for their attendance and for their interest in management and becoming financially literate. And also, we've had some very good questions. We've had a number of questions that enabled us to bridge a lot of subject area, and that's always very useful. So thank you very much to the people who have participated, and thank you, Tim, and thank you, Chris.
And thank you, Paul. And
thank you.
Finally, thanks to you all for taking part. It's been a pleasure to hopefully make some positive contribution.